"Mama, why did that policeman hit you?" The words arrive like a pebble dropped into still water. For a heartbeat, the park holds its breath. A palms clap, the metallic sting of impact, a small body tucked against a mother's side. Then a chorus of phones rising, a dozen faces turned, a vacuum of noise where normal Saturday chatter once lived. Kesha Washington's cheek flushed red where the officer's hand had landed. She did not cry out. She did not lunge. She lifted her daughter with an economy of motion that was both motherly and deliberate, angled the child away from the shock, and reached with one steady hand for the small recorder in her bag. Her other hand pressed lightly against the place that throbbed. The skin already showed the arc of the slap. The world around her was a dozen simultaneous reactions. A child's whimper, the wet smacking of a stroller wheel on concrete, a man shouting for someone to call 911, a woman asking if everyone was okay. Phones captured the moment at different angles. A close-up of Kesha's face as she blinked once and looked toward the officer. A wide shot showing the playground frozen like a stage set. A trembling clip focused on Amara's small shoulders as she squeezed her mother. The audio recorded the officer's voice, sharp, uncompromising, but those words would be dissected later. For now, the footage existed, raw and undeniable. Public space, uniformed officer, woman struck in daylight. Nobody on the bench knew in that breathless instant that the woman being hit was not merely a mother defending her child. Nobody knew that she had spent 3 weeks watching the officers who patrolled this stretch of the city, mapping patterns, recording interactions, quietly cataloging what she believed were repeated violations of residents' rights. They did not know she was Kesha Washington, an undercover special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation assigned to an investigation into discriminatory practices by local officers. An investigator whose job, until that second, had been to disappear into the ordinary rhythm of the neighborhood. Kesha's training took over in a way instinct felt it could not. She waited for the contortions people make under stress, an officer bristling, a partner bracing. Then she moved with purpose. She extracted her phone, confirmed timestamps. She glanced at the officer's badge number through the swelling crowd and mouthed it into her pocket notebook. She sent a terse message to her supervisor. Location, subject, immediate physical contact, witness footage incoming. That short message would convert the scene from a neighborhood incident into evidence in a federal civil rights inquiry. But in the moment, it was simply a mother making sure the world would be able to tell the truth of what had just occurred. The officer at the center of the commotion, uniform neat, badge glinting, stood for a beat as if surprised that his hand had landed. Around him, a partner in plain view, and a third officer adjusting a radio. Voices rose, some in defense, some in shock, some in anger. A woman, later identified by neighbors as Mrs. Carter, kept repeating, "He slapped her, he slapped her." A man who would be known as Mr. Johnson called to another bystander to save the video. The Rodriguez family stared from the curb. A teen tucked his chin and recorded. Kesha looked at Amara, then at the phones, and for the first time allowed an expression. Resolute, not brittle. She told Amara in a low voice to stay close. Her composure was not the absence of pain. It was training married to maternal instinct. She had rehearsed for violence of many kinds in the quiet rooms of the Bureau. She had not rehearsed the small, private rupture of a child seeing an adult struck in public. That image would lodge in her the way a splinter lodges, small, precise, impossible to ignore. Within minutes, videos were already being shared, unreadable fragments of outrage threaded with how and why. The initial clip that later circulated online was grainy but unambiguous, the sound of the slap, the tilt of Kesha's head, the officer's posture. Captions would call it a blatant abuse of power. Others would ask for context. Context arrived in the form of another message from Kesha, time-stamped and sent through secure channels. Undercover, long-term surveillance. I am victim and agent. Preserve all video. Notify DOJ if necessary. The terse line read like procedure, but it carried another charge entirely. The investigator had become the injured party. If the park had been a stage, the next act was quick and public. Dozens of bystanders offered statements to anyone who would listen, short, vivid notes of what they had seen. Mrs. Vasquez, who walked her small grandson through these playgrounds every morning, said she had watched officers push kids away from benches not long before. Mr. Johnson told a local reporter about a pattern he had noticed. Certain young black men stopped and asked for identification far more often than others. The Hernandez family recounted a night when officers had dispersed children playing late, using language that felt more punitive than preventive. These were not isolated complaints. They were small, repeating units of suspicion and friction that, when stacked, suggested a pattern. Kesha had watched these pieces come together for weeks. Her notes, detailed, meticulous, tracked times of day, officer names, badge numbers where visible, phrases used, and the reactions of those stopped. She had mapped patrol routes and cross-referenced them with 911 calls and complaints that seldom produced follow-up. In her reports, she wrote in the crusty shorthand of investigators, observations, corroborative witness accounts, timestamps, video links, and an emerging thesis. A unit of patrols operating with a culture that tolerated, and at times encouraged, forceful and racially disparate enforcement. Back at the edge of the park, Officer Derek Whitman, who had approached the bench that morning as part of a routine patrol, now faced a camera that would not be easily dismissed. He blinked. He adjusted his belt. He told a reporter later, in a sanitized statement, that he had been responding to a complaint. The initial versions of the police narrative would frame the encounter as a minor scuffle, a misread of intent. These versions, as would become clear, left out the most important fact: physical contact had occurred. A common sequence in cases like this is swift. A person raises their voice. A push is rendered. The department issues an internal review, and the world moves on. What made this moment different was not only the presence of video — smartphones have been turning private moments into public evidence for years — but the identity of the woman on the bench and the network of documentation she had quietly been building. When an undercover federal investigator becomes involved, the ley lines of jurisdiction shift. Local accounts must now contend with federal statutes designed to protect civil rights. By the time local reporters arrived, the footage had multiplied. Phone after phone, angle after angle. An elderly man named Mr. Johnson handed a clip to a young journalist and said simply, "We all saw it." The journalist uploaded the footage to social media, and 100 eyes turned to the park. In the span of an hour, the incident had left the neighborhood and entered a broader city conversation. People who had never been to that playground were watching evidence of a public assault, raw and hard to dismiss. Kesha's message to her chain of command had the effect she intended. Deputy Director Sarah Mitchell, overseeing the field office, recognized the gravity immediately. An undercover agent injured in the line of an evidence-gathering operation transforms a case. Something previously conceptual becomes concretely prosecutable. The Bureau convened a small team within hours: a legal advisor, an evidence technician, 2 case agents, and Kesha's immediate supervisor. They called Commander Patricia Hayes at the city's police department to formally inform her that a federal investigation was underway and to request preservation of all relevant materials, including body-worn camera footage, incident reports, dispatch logs, and any amended narratives. Commander Hayes's voice on the call was measured. She thanked the Bureau for the notice and said she would look into it. Behind her courtesy, a different conversation was already starting in the precinct: how to reconcile 2 versions of the same event, public video and an officer's initial account. The first hint that the local narrative might stray from reality would appear in a report filed later that day. Entries that omitted mention of physical contact, descriptions that framed the exchange as escort assistance. The difference between those words and what the videos showed would become an evidentiary fracture. In the quiet of the FBI field office, agents began to pull together the larger canvas. Kesha sat across from the team leader, her daughter's small crayon drawings folded in the bottom of her bag as if to anchor her. She walked them through the 3-week window she had been working: patrol patterns, instances that suggested selective enforcement, and interactions where officers used threats of Child Protective Services as a tactic to cow residents, an intimidation strategy Kesha had recorded on several occasions. She produced a stack of time-stamped videos, witness statements she had elicited during casual conversations, and her own surveillance logs. The team's evidence lead cross-referenced Kesha's notes with independent sources. They pulled dispatch logs, requested any prior complaints filed, and began reconstructing a timeline. Early numbers suggested that the team could credibly tie more than a dozen prior incidents to the same unit. This aggregation mattered legally. A single chaotic encounter is one thing. A documented pattern of conduct, multiple stops, multiple threats of child welfare intervention, repeated physical contact, is another matter entirely. Collected and corroborated, those patterns could support federal civil rights charges, allegations that the officer willfully deprived individuals of constitutional protections because of race or status. As the team worked, neighborhood voices threaded through the office like a continuous tape. Mrs. Carter's recollection of a boy forced off a bench the week before. The Hernandez family's account of a late-night dispersal. Mrs. Vasquez's observation that some children were kept from the playground out of fear. The Rodriguez family, who lived across the street, said they had noticed the same pair of officers more often, arriving late nights, asking questions, moving people along. Their testimony was tentative. Many in the neighborhood had long been conditioned to distrust formal complaint procedures that rarely produced change. That reluctance to report, the team realized, had itself become part of the pattern the investigation exposed. Kesha's dual role complicated everything. As an undercover agent, she had been tasked with blending into daily life, gathering ordinary testimony, and collecting ordinary videos, the kind of stuff people did not think to save. As a mother, she had sought to shield her child from exactly that kind of exposure. Her files reflected how she balanced those aims. Redacted contact lists for witnesses who feared retaliation, audio clips labeled with neutral descriptors like female voice, witness, rather than names, and a methodical chronology that always placed civilian safety before investigative zeal. There was pressure in the office, procedural and moral. Federal prosecutors, when briefed, would need to be satisfied not only that an unconstitutional application of force had occurred, but that the case could be provable beyond a reasonable doubt. That proof demanded meticulous work, multi-angle video, corroborative witness statements, dispatch records that contradicted police narratives, and documentation showing an officer's mindset or pattern. Even with an undercover agent as the injured party, the Bureau could not rely on emotion. It had to rely on evidence that would survive cross-examination. Back in the neighborhood, the immediate fallout was messy. The police department released an initial incident entry that did not mention physical contact. Local activists flagged what they called a sanitized account, while others urged calm and patience for the investigative process. Kesha received a call from Deputy Director Mitchell instructing restraint and reminding the team that while the footage was damning, the Bureau had to proceed in ways that preserved the integrity of the investigation. Kesha agreed, professionally, but she felt the internal conflict, the personal desire for immediate accountability, and the agent's obligation to build a case that could hold in court. Media interest broadened the scope. Local stations replayed clips, opinion pieces debated policing tactics and the role of video in modern accountability. City officials offered polite statements about internal reviews. Community groups organized a vigil at the park that evening. People left flowers on the bench where Kesha had been sitting. The vigil was not just for the slap. It was for all the small indignities residents said they had grown tired of. Interrogations, threats, nights when the lights seemed dimmer because parents kept kids inside to avoid attention. The Bureau's evidence unit cataloged 17 incidents in an initial log. Stops, threats, physical contacts, that they believed formed a coherent pattern. Each entry carried a short description: date, time, officers involved, civilians affected, available video links and witness contacts. The legal advisor framed the collection in neutral language. Pattern of conduct consistent with discriminatory enforcement. Further analysis recommended. It was, in legal terms, a preliminary matrix of plausibility. Word of the federal involvement changed the tenor of conversations at the precinct. Commander Hayes called a meeting with her lieutenants, trying to anticipate the questions the Bureau would ask. Would the department preserve materials? Had any reports been amended? Were there witnesses who had not yet been interviewed? Internal communications would later show the flurry of messages. Requests to locate body-worn camera footage, notes to check dispatch records, and queries about whether officers had received recent training on de-escalation and civil rights obligations. Officer Whitman, whose name now trended in online threads and neighborhood posts, was placed on administrative duty while the agency assessed the immediate situation. In the coming days, a narrative war would start. The local report versus recorded video, uncorroborated memories versus time-stamped files, the officer's explanation versus the witness chorus. For investigators, the dispute was not about emotion, but about documentary weight. The community reacted not only with sympathy, but with a cautious, newly emboldened determination. People who had once assumed that complaining was futile found themselves swapping videos and texts. The very act of recording, of turning a phone camera toward a public wrong, had created a new kind of evidence, one that could no longer be easily erased by a single report. Neighbors who might have otherwise stayed silent now volunteered to come forward with statements. Some agreed to formal interviews, others to recorded recollections. The sense that this time might be different, because of the existence of footage, and because the aggrieved was herself an agent, infused the air. Kesha, meantime, sat in a conference room once reserved for evidence briefings, and now temporarily a room for grief management. She talked through the incidents she had logged. She listened to accounts from the Hernandez household and the Rodriguez family, and she heard in their voices a mixture of relief and fear. Relief that someone had taken notice. Fear of reprisal. She felt the weight of both the badge and the motherhood at once. When she closed her eyes, she saw Amara's small hands clinging to her sweater. She vowed silently that the child's playground would not be a place marked by fear. The Bureau's next steps were pragmatic. They secured and duplicated every video. They reached out to civilian witnesses and requested interviews. They obtained the preliminary police report and noted discrepancies. The absence of any mention of physical contact was a glaring omission. The investigative lead prepared a memo for federal prosecutors, summarizing the facts as documented. Undercover agent injured during surveillance, multiple corroborating videos, community witnesses prepared to provide statements, prior incidents suggesting a pattern of discriminatory stops and threats. As the memo circulated, a layer of institutional friction surfaced. Local leaders bristled at the idea of federal intervention into their police matters. Some city officials framed the Bureau's involvement as an escalation, a step that would complicate healing. Activists and neighbors argued the opposite. Federal scrutiny offered a chance to force accountability where internal mechanisms had failed. The tension was typical of cases that straddle local control and federal civil rights enforcement, a political theater built around competing institutional prerogatives. At the precinct, a revised incident entry began to circulate internally, one that included an acknowledgement of a contact. The reason for the amendment would later become a focus of investigators. Why had the earlier entry omitted the physical act? Who wrote the revised account and when? Those questions would animate minutes of interviews and internal reviews, but for the present, their existence alone suggested the possibility of at least one intentional obfuscation. Days after the incident, Kesha returned to the park with Amara in tow. The bench bore the faint memory of the slap, a small, flattened patch of grass where a bouquet had been left. Children's laughter, slower to return, now edged the playground. Kesha watched Amara reach for the swing and felt the familiar dual ache, pride that her daughter could still find joy, sorrow that the world had shown its harsher face. She explained in plain words that sometimes people in uniform make mistakes, and that sometimes those mistakes hurt people they should protect. She told Amara that the adults were working on making sure it would not happen again. "We are going to make sure people know what happened," Kesha said. "People will see it. People will say it aloud." Amara nodded, accepting the assurance at the age of 8 that the world could be fixed by grown-ups who do their jobs. The Bureau's file thickened. Interviews with neighbors produced a braided narrative. Officers who preferred certain blocks for stops. Adults who avoided the park after dark because of confrontations. Children who had been dispersed from play structures for reasons that parents found petty and punitive. The investigative team argued that when local enforcement patterns repeatedly targeted the same populations with heavier-handed measures, federal attention was warranted. Behind closed doors, the Bureau prepared to escalate. They would need formal approval from the U.S. Attorney's Office to pursue a criminal civil rights case. They would need to present a compelling package, video that corroborated the agent's account, witness testimony that was both consistent and credible, and documentation that showed patterns beyond the single slap. The team felt with a tangible sense of urgency that the incident's public nature and the depth of documentation gave them a rare opportunity to hold individual actors, and perhaps the unit's culture, to account. Yet the path forward was not guaranteed. Legal thresholds for civil rights prosecution are exacting. The prosecution would have to show that the defendant acted willfully to deprive someone of their rights. The Bureau's attorneys explained the standard with quiet care. It is not enough to show a mistake or an overreaction. The state of mind matters. Evidence that suggested a culture of permissive force, threats used repeatedly, a pattern of selective enforcement, could help bridge that gap. The team began to draw lines between the individual acts documented and the broader pattern they formed. As the investigators threaded the evidence together, one question loomed large. How would a local police department respond when federal investigators asked for records that revealed discrepancies? Would the department cooperate? Would it resist? Would it try to reform the narrative? Those tactical considerations were not only legal maneuvers, they were moral indicators of how the institution would take responsibility. Kesha's role shifted from passive witness to a central, complicated figure in the unfolding drama. She had to maintain her cover in certain respects, preserving witness anonymity where requested, ensuring ongoing surveillance could continue without alerting those being monitored. She also had to navigate the emotional tightrope of being an injured party who was, by training, supposed to keep a measured distance from the work. She filed her own medical and incident reports through federal channels, created a record that could stand in court, and debriefed with trauma counselors at the Bureau who specialized in agents harmed in the field. Community leaders began to organize a formal meeting with Commander Hayes and other city officials. They demanded transparency. They wanted accountability. They wanted to see that the police department's claims matched the video available to the public. The public pressure, coupled with the federal inquiry, created a momentum that neither institutional silence nor bureaucratic inertia could easily halt. In the middle of the week following the incident, a young woman named Maria Rodriguez, Officer Whitman's regular partner that day, agreed to speak with investigators off the record. She sat across from the case agent with hands that would not stop fidgeting. I didn't know it would, she started, then stopped. Her sentences stumbled. She told the agent she had felt pressure from certain supervisors to be aggressive in clearing the park when complaints came in about loitering. She described in halting terms how tactical language and unit culture could tighten into an operational norm, how jokes and dismissive phrases sometimes work their way into official conduct. Maria did not offer a dramatic confession, but she did provide a crucial piece of texture that the investigators needed. An account of internal encouragement toward more forceful methods, an admission that officers sometimes leaned on threats that included calling child welfare authorities when parents did not cooperate. For investigators, her testimony was not just about that afternoon's slap. It was about documenting a normalized approach that, when multiplied across days and neighborhoods, could amount to a pattern. Kesha listened to these developments with a complex sense of relief and unease. Relief that someone inside the unit was willing to talk. Unease because she had hoped the pattern would be stopped without the cost of a personal assault. She kept thinking about Amara's small face at the bench, how quickly a child registers power and fear. The fight ahead, she understood, was larger than any one officer's fate. It would be about rewriting routines and expectations that had been normalized. Investigators began to prepare to interview Officer Whitman formally. They compiled their video package, synchronized footage from at least 3 separate devices, and built a timeline that matched voice to motion. They knew that in any interview, his memory and his narrative would be pitted against a mass of multimedia evidence. They also knew the defense in such cases often relied on challenging witness credibility or framing contact as incidental. The investigator's job was to dismantle those defenses with corroboration, matching witness statements to timestamps, showing prior behavior patterns, and highlighting reporting inconsistencies. The city's internal files, when requested, contained an amended report. The document's revision history would later become a point of scrutiny. An initial entry that lacked mention of physical contact, followed by an update after the footage had begun to circulate. For the investigators, the amendment was more than a clerical curiosity. It was a possible indicator that the incident's documentation had been reshaped in response to public scrutiny. That possibility demanded careful review: who altered the record and why, and whether any intent to mislead could be established. As the scope of evidence grew, so did the stakes. The Bureau elevated the case internally, briefing senior leadership in the field office and coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office. They did not yet announce charges. They did not yet make arrests. But the gears of federal investigation were turning, and the team knew their next steps would matter for how the narrative solidified in public view and in legal terms. Late one evening, Kesha and her supervisor sat in the small cafeteria of the field office, a takeout container between them. They talked quietly, not about tactics, but about the human consequences. "She's 8, Kesha said, thinking of Amara, the way the child had pressed into her side. "She'll remember hands and voices." Her supervisor reached across the table and touched Kesha's forearm, a small gesture of solidarity that said without words, "We see this. We will try." Outside, the city continued. The park bench, a plain wooden slat warmed by late sun, kept its small, stubborn presence. People passed by and sometimes paused, their conversations folding into the daily cadence. Some were angry, others simply curious to see how institutions would respond when the civic record was public, and the victim was also an agent of the law. The Bureau's preliminary assessments would soon be presented to federal prosecutors. The focus at that stage was legal sufficiency. Could the evidence support charges under federal civil rights statutes? Could they prove willfulness? Did the pattern of prior interactions suggest systemic issues rather than a single regrettable act? For investigators, each video clip and each witness statement was a thread to be woven into a narrative that could withstand cross-examination. But before formal steps were taken, there was another unavoidable reality: the fallibility of institutions. Different agencies viewed their respective roles with varying priorities. For some city officials, the goal was damage containment. For community leaders, it was transparency and accountability. For the Bureau, it was a careful, methodical building of a case that could be proven in court. Those competing logics would shape the tempo of the response and the eventual public understanding of what had unfolded on that bench. Kesha's next moves were driven by both the personal and the professional. She continued to meet with witness families. She documented her own injuries in medical records that could stand in court, and she maintained surveillance operations where possible to avoid tipping off patterns she had not yet fully documented. She counseled neighbors about preserving footage and offered avenues to submit statements securely. Every action balanced the urgency of justice with the patience of procedure, and overhead, the city's conversation shifted in subtle but important ways. The incident no longer belonged solely to the people who had been there that afternoon. It had become a public artifact, video and testimony, demanding answers from institutions whose design is to serve and protect. People began to ask new questions. What are the norms of policing in neighborhoods like this? Who decides when force is acceptable? How are complaints investigated? Those questions, once rhetorical, were beginning to seek procedural answers. At the end of the week, Kesha carried Amara home through streets that suddenly felt different, lined with neighbors who waved or fell silent in recognition. The child pulled at her hand and asked for a story about a brave little girl who never stopped swinging, no matter the weather. Kesha smiled and told a story about resilience without labeling it as such. The small tale was, for both, sufficient to restore a measure of equilibrium. If you've ever seen or recorded something you believed was wrong, tell us in the comments. What did you do next? That night, investigators compiled their package and prepared to brief prosecutors. They had video, witness statements, dispatch logs, and an amended police report that did not match the public record. They had an undercover agent who had become an injured complainant and a member of the patrol unit whose conduct now required intense scrutiny. They had statements from neighbors who described a pattern of demeaning treatment and threats involving child services, and a partner officer whose account suggested unit-level pressures. The case, at least in the early hours, presented a stark binary: a recorded public assault in daylight and a patchwork of official entries that sought to minimize it. The legal calculus that followed would hinge on proving not just that an assault occurred, but that the assault fit within a larger pattern that indicated willful deprivation of civil rights. The team believed they had enough at least to press for a federal inquiry. Across town, Commander Hayes sat at her desk, turning over a printed copy of the incident report. She placed a call to the Bureau to assure them of cooperation, and then another call to her Internal Affairs Unit to request an audit of the amendment history. She had to manage both public optics and departmental integrity. The ribbons of civic trust were frayed. Whether they could be mended depended on choices in the coming weeks. Kesha lay awake that night thinking about documentation. Who kept it? How it was preserved? How a simple video could alter the course of an investigation? She thought about how often people assumed that an experience witnessed in private could be discounted by those in power. She thought about how modern devices had changed that calculus. The camera in a stranger's pocket had become a civic safeguard, as important as any law. Her file grew heavier. The investigative team would soon request formal civil subpoenas, a preview of the federal reach to come. They would ask for internal communications, training materials, and for every version of every report. The request would strain relations. They would also set in motion a process through which the department's own records might either confirm the neighbors' memories or expose inconsistencies. Before dawn, in a small windowed room at the U.S. Attorney's Office, a prosecutor named Janet Kim reviewed the evidence packet. She considered legal thresholds and the practical risks of charging. She looked at the videos, at Kesha's taped statements, at a log enumerating prior incidents. The question was not whether something ugly had happened on the bench. It was whether the evidence could support charges that an officer had willfully violated civil rights protected under federal law. She read with care each witness account. For prosecutors, the decision-making process is always an actuarial one, the weight of evidence balanced against the certainty of achieving a lawful conviction. Outside those rooms, the neighborhood continued to hum, alive with the small acts of daily life. A woman sweeping steps, music from a second-floor window, a pair of friends debating the latest city news. The park, scarred but still present, awaited the coming of children the next day. There was a sense, fragile and potent, that the place could be reclaimed. Investigators closed the first week's files with a clear course: preserve all evidence, interview additional witnesses, and prepare a prosecutorial referral. Kesha returned to work in a limited capacity, balancing court preparations with mothering. She still felt the phantom of the slap, an afterimage that flared when Amara chased birds across the grass. She used that image as fuel, to document more carefully, to demand the rigor needed to translate a moment of assault into durable accountability. The case had moved from a single public moment into a legal and civic process with wider ramifications. For the first time in a long time, neighbors were not only watching but providing records of what they had seen. For Kesha, that transformation was both vindication and a sobering reminder. Visibility had power, but it was the labor of documentation that converted power into legal consequence. The following day would begin the slow march of formal interviews, subpoenas, and administrative reviews. The park would continue to be a barometer for community sentiment. The federal inquiry now underway would test institutional commitments to transparency and to civil rights. And in the space between the slap and the law, people who had once felt voiceless were beginning to feel, for the first time in a long while, heard. Investigators moved with the patience of people who knew haste could undo what clarity had built. Subpoenas arrived in envelopes that felt heavier than their paperweight. Internal emails, versions of incident reports, dispatch logs, training rosters. The Bureau's evidence team synchronized each clip, calibrated audio waves against timestamps, and cataloged the small mismatches that pointed toward a larger story. Every redaction, every altered sentence in the department's records became a thread to pull. Janet Kim, the prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office, read the files with a steady, careful eye. She marked places where witness statements aligned with video frames and underlined the passages where the amended police narrative diverged from what cameras and bystanders had captured. Prosecutors do not decide on gut. They decide on proof. The package she received was thick enough to demand attention. Multiple vantage points of the same moment, a partner's tentative admissions, a community willing to come forward, and an undercover investigator whose on-the-record notes tied incidents together across weeks. The first formal interview with Officer Derek Whitman was scheduled for mid-morning. He arrived in civilian clothes, A guarded man moved by counsel and the uncomfortable knowledge that the day on the bench would be replayed in painstaking detail. The room where he sat had no window and artificial light that flattened faces. The agents played the synchronized footage back for him. The images were ordinary in their directness. The approach, the exchange, the strike. There was little space left for plausible alternative readings. Wittman attempted to frame the encounter as a response to perceived non-compliance, an escalation he said happened in the chaos of the moment. He described feeling pressured, of acting on instinct when he thought a child might be in danger, of trying to restore order. The words were familiar in investigations, a narrative of situational urgency, a claim of misperception. But the video yielded its own testimony, repeated moments of calm, clear sightlines, bystander angles that showed neither threat nor flight. Corroborating witness statements placed Kesha's stance and demeanor in contrast to the officer's account. Maria Rodriguez's interviews, by contrast, shifted the terrain. At first tentative, she gradually provided texture that went beyond the single afternoon. She spoke of supervisory language that pried at boundaries, offhand encouragement to move folks along, comments about how certain blocks needed special attention, and a casualness about using the threat of child welfare involvement as leverage. Maria described smaller acts that, stacked together, had taught officers what was tolerable and what would pass without consequence. Her words were not a theatrical confession. They were the account of someone who had been present for a culture that had once felt routine. That culture, ordinary, normalized, and rarely questioned, was what investigators were trying to demonstrate. A single touch meant little in isolation. A repeated tactic, applied against a defined segment of the population, suggested intention. The Bureau's legal team and prosecutors focused their arguments on pattern, the repeated use of threats, the selective enforcement of minor infractions, and the recurring erosion of community trust. Those patterns, when paired with clear photos and video, could help establish the willfulness that federal law required. As the investigation tightened, so did public scrutiny. Local press covered developments with soberness that matched the gravity of the subject. City officials issued statements promising cooperation and internal reviews, while insisting that the department would respect due process and the rights of its officers. Community organizers set a calendar of public forums and legal clinics to help neighbors preserve evidence and, if they wished, to file formal complaints. In living rooms and corner stores, people compared notes: who had been stopped where, what was said, which patrols seemed to prefer certain stretches of sidewalk. The act of sharing became in itself a form of resistance. Negotiations across agencies were tense but procedural. Deputy Director Sarah Mitchell insisted on adherence to evidentiary standards and respect for the integrity of Kesha's undercover work. At times, the Bureau's need to protect sources and methods required carefully calibrated disclosures to local partners. Commander Patricia Hayes, mindful of the department's internal cohesion and public obligations, navigated a precarious path, preserving cooperation without appearing to capitulate to federal scrutiny. Those institutional dynamics influenced the tempo of each tribunal and the eventual public narrative. When prosecutors presented the formal charging decision to the grand jury, they did so with a layered file, synchronized video, statements from civilian witnesses like Mrs. Carter and Mr. Johnson, Maria Rodriguez's detailed account of unit culture, and Kesha's own surveillance packets. The grand jury returned an indictment that moved the case into the criminal realm. For many in the neighborhood, the formal charging validated what months of informal testimony and viral footage had suggested: that the bench was not an isolated scene, but part of a pattern of misconduct. Facing the weight of material evidence and the prospect of federal charges, Wittman's defense counsel entered plea discussions. Prosecutors had to weigh the certainty of a conviction against the uncertainties of trial. Trials are litmus tests for evidence and for credibility. Witnesses can be impeached, video can be argued, and juries can surprise. A negotiated plea offered predictability and an assured public record that, at least in the short term, meant accountability. The plea hearing was held in a federal courtroom that smelled faintly of old leather and polished wood. The proceedings were brisk and formal. The judge read the charges aloud. Wittman pled guilty to the offense as outlined in the indictment: a willful deprivation of a person's rights under color of law. The words in the courtroom were clinical. The admission, however, carried emotional resonance for those in the gallery who had watched the incident unfold on their phones weeks before. Sentencing followed later, after a presentence report and victim impact statements. Kesha prepared carefully, balancing the need to speak truthfully with her obligations as an agent. She described the physical sting that remained, and the more enduring impression left on her daughter. She spoke plainly of the erosion of trust that occurs when instruments of safety become sources of fear. The judge's sentence reflected the seriousness of the offense and the federal interest in protecting civil rights. Bittman was ordered to serve time and was subject to additional conditions meant to underscore the case's accountability. Beyond the criminal yardstick, the case rippled into institutional reform. The U.S. Attorney's Office and the police department entered discussions about structural remedies. Community leaders, having advocated for systemic change, were included in some negotiations as stakeholders, voices from the very blocks affected by the unit's practices. The result was not a unilateral decree but a negotiated consent decree overseen by a federal monitor, a binding court order that required the department to adopt specific reforms, report progress to a neutral monitor, and be held publicly accountable for compliance. The consent decree's principal obligations addressed both tools and culture. The department agreed to expand the use and retention of body-worn camera footage, to institute mandatory civil rights and de-escalation training for patrol units, to create more robust incident reporting systems that preserved audit trails, and to strengthen civilian oversight mechanisms to increase transparency. The decree also required supervisors to be evaluated on how they modeled compliance and respect for constitutional policing standards. It represented a legal architecture that sought to convert public outrage and evidentiary clarity into concrete, enforceable practices. Parallel to criminal and institutional outcomes, civil avenues proceeded. The community and the Bureau supported mediated conversations that resolved civil claims through confidentiality agreements and structured commitments to training and community investment. Those settlements, terms not always public, provided resources for community programs and funded outreach efforts to rebuild trust. Crucially, these remedies emphasized non-monetary changes, formal apologies in certain cases, commitments to review and reform reporting practices, and funded opportunities for community police dialogues facilitated by neutral practitioners. Within the department, the consequences were palpable. Supervisors were disciplined, training materials were rewritten, roll call discussions included renewed emphasis on constitutional obligations and the risks of using threats against families. Officers were required to complete refresher courses that emphasized bias mitigation and the legal thresholds for force. The reforms were not instantaneous cures. Cultural change is an accumulation of small, repeated choices. But the consent decree created a scaffolding that required those choices to be documented and measured. Maria Rodriguez's arc through the case remained quietly significant. Her willingness to speak with investigators had been a turning point. Her testimonies provided context that video alone could not. Whether her cooperation stemmed from remorse, professional discomfort, or a desire to see a safer practice of policing, the result was the same: a revealing of internal pressures that had normalized intimidation. In the months that followed, she pursued avenues to address the habits she had once adopted. She participated in internal debriefings, attended training on community engagement, and agreed to serve as a speaker in later sessions about how unit culture can drift from policy. Her path was not neatly redemptive. No single act erases complicity, but it contributed to a narrative that accountability could coexist with opportunities for reform. For Kesha, the case's closure was both vindication and a beginning. The criminal conviction and the consent decree created new protections and signaled consequences for abuse, but they did not erase the memory of the slap or the imprint it left on her daughter. In private, she navigated the duality of being a federal agent who had both enforced and become the target of institutional power. She continued to work on civil rights cases, using the experience to sharpen the Bureau's approach to community evidence and witness protection. Publicly, she maintained a measured presence, speaking about the necessity of documentation, about the power of everyday recording, and about the complicated work of holding institutions accountable while preserving the due process rights of individuals. Amara adjusted to the world in parallel, at the small, persistent pace of an 8-year-old. Therapy helped translate the experience into words that felt less like a shadow and more like a story she could tell and then shelve. She learned that courage could look like going to the swings after a hard day, that resilience was sometimes a quiet, ongoing practice. Kesha watched her daughter reclaim normalcy with a relief that never quite shook free of a parent's vigilance. A year after the slap, the park looked different in tangible ways. Cameras were mounted in more visible places and patrols followed revised protocols. Community police forums met regularly in the community center, not as symbolic gestures, but as ongoing spaces for problem-solving. Children played with a fullness that suggested, not the absence of fear, but the presence of accountability. Parents chatted on benches, comparing notes about who they trusted to escort kids home and which streetlights felt reliable. The bench where the incident had occurred remained a quiet marker, sometimes circled by bicycles and sometimes by bouquets, left on anniversaries of community milestones. People still remembered what had happened there. Remembrance, in this case, was paired with institutional evidence of change. The consent decree's monitor filed periodic reports that documented progress and pointed to persistent challenges, gaps in training completion rates, the need for sustained community engagement, and the long shadow of distrust. Those contents were not evidence of failure. They were reminders that reform requires continued oversight. Neighborhood families like the Hernandez and Rodriguez households breathed easier, though not entirely free of worry. They had tangible proof that documentation mattered. Mrs. Vasquez, who had once watched children avoid the playground, now pushed her grandson on a swing without glancing over her shoulder. Mr. Johnson, who had been the one to save the original video on his phone, became a quiet advocate for simple civic practices: how to store footage, where to send it, and whom to trust. The community's civic literacy had improved. The skills of documentation had become a tool for justice as much as a digital habit. At City Hall, officials who had initially bristled at federal involvement began framing the decree as a turning point, a compulsory update that required shifts in leadership and attention to training budgets. Some resisted, others complied with visible energy. The public nature of compliance reports meant that promises could no longer remain private. That transparency reconfigured the dynamics of accountability in a way that, for residents, felt like progress. The case left lingering questions. Questions about how many similar incidents had gone undocumented, about who chooses to record and who remains invisible, and about the uneven geography of enforcement across a city. Those questions did not dissolve with a conviction or a decree. But the framework that the case established made answering them more possible. It created pathways for other victims to come forward, and for community groups to demand that institutions produce records rather than excuses. In quieter moments, Kesha allowed herself the small satisfactions that come from structural fix. A training syllabus that now included modules she had suggested, a civilian oversight board that published meeting minutes, a series of community workshops attended by officers who once patrolled without engagement. These were not victories in the grand sense. They were iterative improvements that, day by day, recalibrated expectations. One afternoon, nearly 12 months later, Kesha sat on a bench in the same park and watched Amara loop across the grass with friends. The child's laughter was a bright thing that the adult in Kesha guarded with skepticism and gratitude. The city skyline, as always, shone indifferent and complex beyond the square of green. Nearby, Commander Hayes greeted a group of parents at a community forum, speaking plainly about accountability and the continuing work required to maintain it. Maria Rodriguez had been invited to one of the sessions as a witness to the change that individual action, however belated, could help catalyze. The room contained people whose trust had been frayed, and people whose jobs required them to rebuild it. That tension, lived in public, felt healthier than the silence that had preceded it. The story's final measure is not a neat ending, but a reopened process. The criminal conviction, the consent decree, the trainings, the community settlements, these were instruments, not endpoints. They spoke of a case that turned a single slap into a series of enforceable changes and national attention. They also left on view the work that remains: persistent oversight, continued community engagement, and the steady practice of preserving evidence, Kesha kept her files in a secure archive, accessible to the teams that would continue the work she had advanced. She wrote, in a brief memo distributed to field agents, a few lines about the power of ordinary documentation and the unusual position she had held as both investigator and victim. That meticulous notes, preserved videos, and the willingness of neighbors to speak plainly were the combination that made accountability possible. Amara, now a little less haunted by the memory, tended a small patch of the community garden with a seriousness that made Kesha ache with pride. Once, when a neighbor asked how she felt about the park, Amara replied simply, "It's my playground again." In the way children render the world legible, that sentence felt both fragile and enormous. For the neighborhood, the lesson settled into ordinary practices. People learned to save footage, to submit it to reliable channels, and to attend oversight meetings. Officers learned to document contact in ways that made later review possible. Public life adjusted to the knowledge that ordinary devices could record extraordinary truths. If this story holds any instruction, it is this. Accountability does not arrive without labor. It arrives when individuals act, when witnesses save a clip, when a neighbor submits a statement, when an agent records patterns, and when prosecutors insist on proving willfulness. It arrives when communities refuse the quiet that lets small injustices calcify into institutional norms. The slap on the bench became a pivot point because people were willing to document, to speak, and to insist that systems follow. If you watch the clip that started this, or if you have ever filmed something that felt wrong, remember the small, practical steps that matter. Preserve your footage, note the time and location, find trustworthy channels to submit it, and consider speaking to community groups that can help translate evidence into action. Change begins with those mundane decisions. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear how documentation and community courage can change institutions. And if you want more investigative stories that track how evidence becomes accountability, subscribe and join the conversation. There are many more episodes of resilience and reform to be told.